Hi, we would like to welcome you all from around the US and the globe as you join us for our explorations at the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. I'm Rachel Schaff of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, now in its 26th year. Our festival theme this year is Polyphonies. We acknowledge that we are mounting this festival and convening our communities together for discussion within context beyond Ithaca. We ask you to remember that the 2023 festival takes place as global climate catastrophe intensifies, as the Russian war in Ukraine continues, as polarizations about race, gender, sexualities, identities, nations, politics, land, air, and water deepen across the globe, and as people across the world endure violence yet continue to fight for our democracy, equality, freedom of expression, and a livable planet. Ithaca is located on the traditional lands of the Cayuga Nation. The Cayuga Nation are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Ithaca College in New York State, in the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Cayuga Nation's dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of the Cayuga Nation people, past and present, to these lands and waters. At the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, the world is our why. I will pass you off to Leah.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Leah Schaefer. I'm an associate producer at FLEF. Major sponsors for FLEF include the Park Foundation and Ithaca College. Our festival theme this year is Polyphonies. Polyphonies joyously layer different voices, practices, and perspectives across the arts, politics, technologies, and ecologies. We are very honored that you have joined us today for this event. We invite you to use the Zoom rename feature to rename yourself with your physical location after your name. Our event will begin with the speakers in conversation with the moderator, then we will open the floor to your questions. During the Q&A, please use the Zoom's raise hand feature, which you can access by clicking the reaction smiley face, which is at the bottom of your screen. It is now with great pleasure that I introduce today's speakers. First, we have our moderator, Raza Rumi, director of the Park Center for Independent Media. We also have Anna Creadick, professor of English and American Studies at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, Matthew Holtmeier, associate professor and co-director of the Film and Media Studies program at East Tennessee State University, and Chelsea Wessels, assistant professor and co-director of the Film and Media Studies program at East Tennessee State University. Welcome.
Well, hello, everyone, and real pleasure to be here. My name is Raza, as was introduced earlier, and I direct the Park Center for Independent Media, and our center also publishes a magazine called The Edge, which is a web magazine and a platform for public writing. Part of the reason that we started it was to foster conversations on issues of national, international importance, and to engage students, the academy, and of course, the communities that are faced with unprecedented issues of the 21st century. And one of the key highlights of The Edge is that it works really in close sort of collaboration and sync with FLEF, which is the parent mothership of this festival, and my dear colleague, Dr. Patricia Zimmerman, who is the director of FLEF and a Dana professor at IC. also happens to be the editor-at-large, and she has infused a new spirit into this magazine. And I'm really honored that some of our really esteemed writers are here at this very first roundtable around the publications that Edge has put out for the publics in the US and beyond. So our topic today deals with a very, very important issue. As you all know, late last year, in the summer, the country watched a historic flood devastating the central Appalachian region. This flood killed dozens of people, swept away homes, destroyed farms and businesses, and decimated the infrastructure in several counties of the region, resulting in thousands of displaced people. And often, such stories are not mainstreamed. They are not talked about in the corporate media, particularly about how displaced people, or what we call globally, using the UN description as climate refugees within their own countries. And that particular devastation, prompted us to request some of our speakers and others to contribute and tell the story of this region and how it has been represented, how it has been covered, and what has not been covered. And before I do, I invite our first speaker, I would like to add further that, this region also happens to be one of the poorest in the United States. And as it happens, the media attention also went away because the media and its link with advertising, or those who can buy things that are popularized through different television channels or newspapers, was not really the case in this particular region. So that's why a lot of people do not know this story. And I'm so grateful to our contributors who actually have informed us and given us such nuanced understanding of what was going on. The speakers have already been introduced. Our key goal, both at FLEF and at the Edge, has been to open up this dialogue and nurture it about how the relationships between the floods, the environment, the media representations, and the climate grief, as one of our authors mentioned, work in a multi-layered manner that, of course, is both a commentary on the society and politics and ecology, changing ecologies of the region that we're talking about. So without further ado, I would request Anna Creadick to start and maybe talk a bit about her piece that she wrote, but also not just limited to that piece, but also her thoughts on this, the notion of climate grief. Yes, Anna.
Thank you, Raza. Thanks to you and Patty and everyone for the invitation to be here and for running the piece in the Edge. I think, as you said, this is one of the problems we're up against is invisibility. And the piece that I wrote about the Appalachian floods and climate grief begins with that idea that the region of Appalachia has a kind of, there's a pattern in American media's relationship to the region, and the pattern is a kind of remembering and forgetting that occurs over and over. And in the in the 1960s, by 1960, 90% of American households had a television. By 1962, you could already watch the Beverly Hillbillies on that television. So the Appalachia has a kind of fraught history as an American media object. We like to look at it, and there are distorted representations of it, and it becomes the poster child for things like the war on poverty during LBJ's presidency. But there is also a pattern of Appalachian invisibility. And so pieces like mine and venues like the Edge that are kind of spotlighting the region in new ways and in ways that tend to be, kind of more rare, are really important interventions in that media representation. One of the things that I that I write about is the flood. I wasn't in Appalachia at the time. Ironically, I was actually supposed to be down there for a writer's workshop at Heinemann, which is a longstanding kind of cultural institution, the Heinemann Settlement School in Kentucky. And at the last minute, I was unable to go, but friends of mine who were there, had their rental cars washed down the creek. They had to be evacuated out. Between July 25th and July 30th, they experienced 4 inches of rain per hour. Some of the news coverage that I've read said a lot of the people in the area didn't even get news. They didn't, they have it's an area that has limited, and in many cases limited broadband access. So people weren't even getting the proper flood alerts. And so there have been a kind of series of crises on top of crises in this event. But because I was supposed to be there, I have had a kind of intense emotional attention to it, in addition to my just scholarly interest in the region. So what I write about in my piece is that there were tragedies within tragedies. There's loss of life, there's loss of property, there's loss of farms. There's the kind of environmental disaster that happens when floods like this happen. But what I wanted to highlight was that there are 2 centers of Appalachian cultural production in the region that were hit by this disaster. One is the Heinemann Settlement School, where I was going to go to this writer's workshop. And the other was Apple Shop, which is in Whitesburg, Kentucky, and has been there since 1969 and is a center of Appalachian documentary filmmaking. And so both of these I call them centers of the Appalachian means of production, because they are places in which people inside the region can tell stories about the region and disseminate those stories that are not distortions like the Beverly Hillbillies. And there are also places for Appalachian people to tell their own stories and have those traditions preserved. And so these 2 institutions were, for me, the kind of most heartbreaking loss of this particular climate disaster, because as I ask in the piece, how can people care about an Appalachia that no one can see? The third thing I wanted to mention, I guess, in these opening comments, we're just kind of thinking again about this problem of Appalachian visibility and its invisibility. I just returned from an Appalachian Studies conference this past weekend, which was down in Athens, Ohio, and I heard so many interesting sort of comments. One person was talking about the floods and said, we've been through the rescue, we've been through the relief, now we're in recovery, and that's going to take years and years and years. And I think that the language we use about natural disasters obscures the way that there are certain populations and areas and regions that are actually being the targets of disaster in a way that is not natural at all. That's actually cultural, that's structural, and that's part of a design. So one of the questions that I have for the panelists today and for all of you to think about is how do we keep the spotlight on an area that tends to be rendered invisible by the national media, and who is keeping the spotlight on the region and through what means? Another great line that I heard that I've been still thinking about since I was at the conference was someone said, artists are the first responders in a disaster like this. And so I've been thinking a lot about the role that artists and filmmakers and writers and singers and others play in keeping our attention where it needs to be. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anna, and very great lines at the end. I mean, artists being at the sort of vanguard of responding to challenges and crises such as the climate crises or the emergency that we face globally and in particular in this region. So we'll move to Matt Holtmeier, and over to you, Matt, for your comments.
Thank you, Raza, and thank you, Anna. That was an amazing introduction because there's so much to unpack. There's so much to talk about. My particular interest in this, stems from research into bioregional media, and I'm from the Pacific Northwest. There's a particular relationship with media from the Pacific Northwest, but I now live and work in Appalachia, of course, and the Apple Shop, which Anna mentioned, is probably the best example of a bioregional media workshop, right? Making media in the place, from the place, and acknowledging the local environments of that place in that media itself. And so, I was very excited when I was able to move down here. I remember I visited the Apple Shop actually when I came down for a job interview. And that was an exciting experience for me. But and Anna also mentioned this sort of cycle of remembering and forgetting, and I think that's a really important topic here because it's a cycle of remembering and forgetting for folks outside the region, right? But folks inside the region never forget. There's a long history and a long memory inside Appalachia, and that's an important part of bioregional media too, right? That's what sort of distinguishes it from media outside the region, but about the region, and media made in the region at places like the Apple Shop, right? So you get this sort of totally different experience of the place. And in our article, we talk about some of those examples. So, if you want to check out some of those examples later, you can look to the article. And I think the difference is striking, right? So you can put these things side by side and see these striking differences. But one of the key things about bioregional media is it's interested in runaway production or extractive industries. And of course, that's a huge topic in Appalachia as well, right? Extractive industries are the core of the history of trauma in the region, where basically outside companies come into Appalachia to extract natural resources and to exploit local labor. And it's a two-pronged thing there that's very important. And the exploiting of the resources comes in many forms. And people are probably familiar with coal mining, right? That's what people think of. Okay, we're taking the resources out of the land, but there's a lot more than that, because it's also exploiting the labor that is present, right? The workforce that is present, and exploiting in interesting ways, because sometimes it's even strike breaking by bringing in outside labor to undermine the local labor, right? So there's like so many aspects of this. Another one is simply buying up the land, and this is a massive topic in Appalachia, because in Appalachian mantra is that there is no private property, because the land belongs to the people who live here. And we have things like ginseng diggers who did not sort of like harvest ginseng from their private property, but would travel throughout the mountains to find patches of ginseng which they would harvest. And we won't get into the whole history of ginseng, but we could talk about that. So there are all these sort of different ways that extractive industries or outside industry has exploited Appalachia. Now, our piece has a little bit more of a specific focus on the horror genre, and that's in relation to other interests that sort of intersect with bioregionalism and this local media. But before I sign off, I just want to say that one thing that I think is important about media made within the place is that it is both attaches to this Fleft's theme of the polyphonies, right? The different voices within the place rather than voices from outside the place, but also community building. Another research interest of mine is third cinema, right? And one of the key elements of third cinema is that cinema or media or whatever is a site of gathering and discussion, not just a thing for consumption, right? And that's what we're seeing in a lot of Appalachian media that is made here and consumed here. Is it becomes a site of gathering. So for example, in our piece we talk about the Old Gods of Appalachia, which is a podcast actually that folks might be familiar with, but it is a podcast that of course could be consumed anywhere, but there's also live shows here. And those live shows are very interesting spaces where I told you this mantra of there is no private land. Like these mantras are literally recited at these gatherings, right? So there's definitely a cycle of remembering and forgetting outside. But then, you come to Appalachia, and there's a deep conviction and a deep history and memory, and actually the media, and even, it might be funny to talk about like the horror genre, which people might not take as seriously, and this is why we sort of use the term dark Appalachia here, because actually there's a lot more going on there than generic fare, and generic media making. And of course, I'll pass this over to Dr. Wessels, to Chelsea, on this topic of documentary too, because Chelsea's written about multiple documentaries in Appalachia as well. And going back to the Apple Shop documentary, that's kind of our point of transition, the Buffalo Creek flood, and depictions of climate grief, in that film, that are terrifying, that are horrifying, that have this like deep grief associated with them, which is also present in this thing that is dark Appalachia. But I'll just pass it off there.
Thank you, Matt. Chelsea, over to you. And I think Matt has given you a great cue to begin with. So
he has, but I'm actually going to back up a little bit and not take that cue right away.
Okay.
Sorry, Matt, because I want to go back to Anna's question about, how do we keep the spotlight and who is keeping the spotlight? Because one of the things that I have found interesting, and like Matt, I am not from this region. I moved here for work. So I've been here about 5 years. But one of the things that was really important to me learning about this was learning about kind of Elizabeth Catt, who's a historian from this area, who we could talk about all day. Don't worry, I'll just like bring out, my blur doesn't work, but What You're Getting Wrong About Appalachia, there it is her book. And one of the things that she talks about that I think is really significant to kind of answering that question is how Appalachia is defined by a top-down process, right? Who talks about what it is. And Matt talked about exploiting the land and exploiting the labor as kind of these forms of exploitation of Appalachia. But I think the third and really important prong of that actually is the exploitation of the image of Appalachia, right? The definition of Appalachia, who these people are, what this land looks like, their history. All of that is often defined outside and by people who are not from here. And I recognize that I'm partially participating in that by being here as some kind of expert, and I'm not. But I think that idea of exploiting the image is a significant part of it. And it's important for thinking about how we keep that spotlight, how we fight back against kind of these ideas of, what it is. And so thinking about documentary, now I'll return back to documentary, but thinking about documentary, so many of the documentaries that Matt and I wrote about in our piece, that I've written about elsewhere, come from, again, these community forms of funding, these community forms of production. And again, there's an emphasis on the community forms of exhibition too. So to connect to that idea of third cinema, of sort of the political action of viewing a film, I think is also a really important piece of this puzzle. So it's not just the, making the film, shedding light on the issue, getting that spotlight, but also thinking about how the film itself can circulate beyond kind of just the interested parties, and beyond just kind of giving this image of Appalachia that people expect, right? And of course, the very obvious example, and I'm just going to say it now so we don't have to talk about it again, is Hillbilly Elegy, right? That defines a version of Appalachia that I know, like when I moved here, that is what my family understood Appalachia to be, right? And Elizabeth Catt's book pushes back on that forcefully, but that's the image that people like where I'm from have. And that image was not created. It's based on images that were created outside of Appalachia, right? And so thinking about how production, distribution, and exhibition of documentaries, of media projects, of writing from this area can really help not just like get the spotlight, but keep the spotlight and shine the spotlight where it actually matters. And some of that is like, how do we think about this not just always being about climate grief and tragedy and trauma? There's so much more here. And I loved what Anna said, that you were repeating from someone else about artists are the first responders, right? What other kinds of art are there that are not just trauma? There's so much more here. And I think that that's something that I know that I've learned a lot about. I'm fortunate to work with really incredible artists and poets in this region, and seeing their work and how they address these issues is transformative. And I want more people to have that opportunity. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anna. And of course, all three wonderful presentations have opened up so many ideas and questions, I guess. So we'll open it up very shortly for our audience here in a couple of minutes. But I just want to follow up with a few, some of the points that were raised earlier. And Anna, I would start with you. In particular, in your piece as well, you had referred to the dehumanization process that also takes place. And I think part of that has to do with the reproduction of the stereotypes about this region, you know, poverty, the opioid crisis, and it's all negative framing. And I would, you know, in the context of these floods and climate crises, I mean, I would like you to speak, maybe elaborate a bit more on that, how certain media productions or representations actually end up dehumanizing the people who are going through this immense grief of our times.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I do know that happened in the wake of the floods, and I think that it was in the space of maybe, you know, just Twitter or Facebook or comments, you know, people would try to post or draw attention to the suffering of people in Eastern Kentucky and Southwest Virginia who had, you know, lost everything. And some of the responses would be, you know, well, this is what happens when you vote, you know, when you vote red, or when you know, vote against climate management kind of policy, or so that there's a lot of victim blaming, because there's been this kind of construction of Appalachian people as, and I think JD Vance has something to, you know, answer for here, but, you know, as politically conservative, as somehow deserving of you know, the poverty that, and the climate disaster that is. Yes. I mean, one of the things that I say in the piece is that Appalachia is the canary in the coal mine of climate change, of climate crisis, and you know, it's a landscape that has already been degraded through strip mining, through mountaintop removal mining, so that the torrential weather event that occurs is sort of exponentially worsened by the fact that the landscape itself can't sustain that much water because of the extractive fossil fuel industry. You know, so it's a complicated tangle of problems. And there's also, so, you know, on the one hand, it's Appalachian people are one of the last kind of safe groups to stereotype or make fun of. It's just openly done in our mass media, and that is a dehumanizing process. But also America dehumanizes poor people. And this is a region of great poverty and deprivation. So there's a kind of, there's like triple or quadruple marginalization that can go on. There's discrimination around accents, around the way that people talk. You know, there's another of the lines that I heard at the conference this weekend was the greatest public health crisis or threat, the biggest health issue we are facing is discrimination. That's what one of the speakers said, because so many of the health policies are tied to discrimination. You know, even things like within the Appalachian region, things like being homeless is now a felony in Tennessee, in terms of like trans healthcare being illegal in the region. So, you know, there are, but then there are these additional ways in which Appalachian problems are, you know, sort of like in the margins, and people have blinders on about that. That's sort of like, well, that's over there. Those are those people. They're not us. They won't ever be us. So yeah, it's kind of a perpetual tension around whether to like feel sympathy for, or outrage against Appalachian folk. Either one is dangerous. I mean, the romance of Appalachia is also dangerous. It's also a kind of othering. It's just a different flavor.
Yeah. Layers and layers of discrimination and marginalization, as you rightly pointed out. So, and, I'll move to Matt, maybe with a follow-up question, from what you wrote and what you just said, Matt. I think the role of documentary here then acquires, as you also demonstrate in your writing for The Edge, I mean, how important and central that has become in a way in terms of not just highlighting some of the horrors of the poverty and discrimination, but also in a way kind of counteracting as a argument or a representation against what the mainstream media portrays the region to be. Am I correct in making that conclusion?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I will say a lot of what I was writing about was not documentary too, right? So even just fictional representations as well. I mean, yes, documentary. Well, I'm not going to make any large claims like that, but maybe documentary has a special power in depicting a people. But as we know, documentary can be just as false as it can tell truth, right? True. But I think that's true of fiction as well, right? So in largely, I think it goes back to this question of, where's the thing made? Who is making it, right? These are like interesting questions that we can actually look up and find out when we look at these media representations. Chelsea brings up the point of where is exhibition happening, and I think that's important. But as consumers, we can do a little bit of research and find out about these things. Like one of the films we write about in this piece is this film Spell, and I mean, we could talk about the distribution here too, because it's like, I think it was like a Netflix film or something, meaning, how many people are popping on Netflix and finding this film that is supposedly an Appalachian film. And this is the extraction of image that Chelsea was talking about, because this film was, made in LA and South Africa, basically, so like Appalachia somewhere in the middle, or not even in the middle, somewhere off in the periphery there, but it doesn't even come close to being from the place. And these examples of this sort of tradition, so there's this sort of idea of, witchcraft in this film, and that witchcraft seems to have no bearing on, anything Appalachian at all, but it's passed off as such, for sure. And in the film, that film is an especially good example, because it sets the main character, who is like a city boy that grew up in Appalachia, right? So it creates that very rural, non-rural distinction from the get-go, and weaponizes it, really. Like that is the crux, or the joke, or even the horror of the film. And really, it's supposed to be a horror film, so it is the horror of the film. It is the person from the city who is afraid of the unknown of the mountains, basically, right? Which, of course, is a home place for people who live here. And that's, I think, the great irony of this conversation. But yeah, I'll just stop there for now.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. Chelsea, feel free to add to what Matt said, or I think one of the things that you raised while you were talking was this insider-outsider tension. I mean, how images are portrayed by outsiders about people, about their land, their histories, so I mean, that particular tension. Now, obviously, there are many views about it. I mean, some people say, well, should outsiders not be able to comment or view things and present them, or is it the whole debate on what is authentic or not authentic, so maybe if you can elaborate that a little bit in the kind of works that you have looked closely for your scholarship and writing.
Yeah, and I think I'll pick up on actually where Matt left it, which is he was talking about Spell as sort of this like use of horror, and the horror is like these Appalachian stereotypes, right? So there, the horror is Appalachia, but the horror is the stereotype. of, you know, this region, of people of these country people and their witchcraft, which is, you know, a whole thing. And I think that that's an interesting contrast to the horror of something like Old Gods of Appalachia, right? And the horror, and we talk about this in our piece for more examples and more in-depth analysis, but the horror there is actually these extractive industries. The horror there comes from, you know, these power dynamics. You know, the mining companies are the source of the horror, right? So it's interesting how horror, just to use this as an example, we talk about dark Appalachia, but how that means something very different from coming from like creators and art within Appalachia versus how it's portrayed when people are looking at Appalachia and depicting it as horrifying. And I think that's like a really important distinction. And I think it's interesting too, even when we turn to documentary and we think about, you know, after being here for a while and watching a lot of documentaries and seeing the documentaries that come through on various, you know, film circuits that visit our school, I'm struck by how obvious it is when they are made by someone outside the region, because they're often very interested in showing, you know, I think kind of just showing like, oh, look how awful it is. And what Anna said earlier about, you know, like somehow they did this to themselves, they deserve this, right? It's kind of like just showing that off, like, well, you know, like this is awful, but this like happened to them because of choices that they have made. And one of the most important things to remember here is like, they didn't, nobody made these choices.
Yes.
You know, so I think that sort of like the distinction of like what is horrifying, and is it the stereotype of the hillbilly in Deliverance versus again in Old Gods of Appalachia, where there's like a demon man who is using bones to create railroads.
Yes.
You know, sorry, that is a spoiler. It's a very small spoiler. I don't think it's going to ruin that for anyone. But you know, like those different constructions of like what is horrifying is I think says a lot about kind of how this region is viewed and how this region views themselves, right? And again, it's more complicated. And I think Anna really laid that out, that it's not about like, you know, victims and all of that, but it is about, you know, what kinds of choices people have and who is making those choices and what options are even placed on the table.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Thank you. Let's open it up for our audience, Q&A, and I'm sure there are many questions and comments or responses awaiting our great speakers this afternoon. In the meantime, okay, great, Kathy. And Andrew, of course. Yes, Kathy.
Thank you, everyone. That's really interesting. I hadn't really focused on this, so you brought my attention to it. I was wondering if you could offer any positive or happy or any kind of anecdotes or local media that might counteract the stereotypes that you're seeing. Just, you know, one or two short stories that changed your mind about the area that you could share with us.
I will start mostly because I just want to steal this really amazing thing, but the poetry of Jesse Graves, who is one of my colleagues. So, but it is that, but I feel like Jesse's poetry, so it's short, you can kind of choose where to access it, really acknowledges the history of this place, but as someone who grew up here and like loves it, I think that like affection for and deep love of like the land and the people and the history really shines through in his work.
Right. So shall we move on to Professor Andrew Utterson?
A wonderful conversation. Thanks so much, everyone. My question picks up on the outside-inside dynamic, but also the question that, or the tension that Anna raised about visibility and invisibility. And I have to admit to knowing Matt and Chelsea from prior years and learning specifically from Matt and Chelsea that Appalachia is not way beyond the Finger Lakes, but actually quite close. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that proximity. But the question in turn is about regions and bioregions and your interest in mapping those. And as you have moved between regions and bioregions, the extent to which Appalachia is not just a projection from the outside, but how conscious the people of this region are of their own collective identity in relation to the environment.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know who, Matt.
I guess I'll be brief because I'm sure everyone has something to say about that. But I mean, the short answer is like very conscious. So and I think Chelsea also has a quote from Diamond Copperhead that she could read to you right now.
I'm ready.
But you know, one thing I will just mention there is that again, when you go to these gatherings, whether it's there was just a public reading by local author Nathan Bollingrud, for example, or the Old Gods of Appalachia show, there you see the collectivity in person, and again, there are collective positions and values that are not just held by people here, but like spoken about very openly. And I mentioned that one that like there is no private property in Appalachia, which might seem like a surprising statement, right? At first, like no private property, that sounds radical. And actually think about that in relation to, what Anna was saying earlier in terms of like, oh, this is such a red place. But like no private property, that's got to be the least red statement of all time, like what is the irony there? But that's because, yes, there is a very specific, culture and view that is here that I don't think anyone, it's hard to access from the outside. That's a big question. But anyway, I'll pass it off there.
Thank you. Anyone wants to add to that, or shall we move to other questions?
I would just quickly say there's a passionate and longstanding tradition of environmental activism in Appalachia, and it continues. I can point to my own family. My parents are part of a grassroots organization to fight an asphalt plant that's trying to be built just over the hill from their farm, to my colleague in Appalachian Studies, Emily Satterwhite, who has been chaining herself to things and getting arrested to prevent the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which is trying to slam through. And this is all also, I just want to mention that the danger of othering Appalachia always comes down, it comes down to hiding exploitation. Because as long as Appalachia seems like over there and those people, then all of us are not continually thinking about the ways in which who we are and what endangers us or what uplifts us is not intrinsically built into that region of Appalachia from Maine to Georgia, right? This is the how far the range can extend. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. So we have two more hands, Sean O'Brien. Maybe we can start with Sean. Yeah.
Hi. I just before I say my question, I just want to say this talk has been very enlightening. So thank you all for speaking. And with so much of Appalachia being reliant on mining and extraction industries, how will the Appalachian economy reconcile with climate change in the future? Where does the future lie for Appalachia as we get further and further away from those industries?
Who would like to take that question? Okay.
Well, part of the maybe this is an irony, but one of the huge we are in one of the top fishing spots in the world, and this might sound like a funny answer, but people fly from all over the fucking world to come fish here and pay ridiculous sums of money to rent a little cabin on the river, and so there's a disconnect between these industries, but also if we just look at the numbers in terms of how many people are in coal mining positions today, coal mining's been automated, it is not bodies, thousands of bodies going down into the mines. I think the number is 6,000 people now are employed in Appalachia in coal mining jobs, and they're operating automated systems and machinery, So I think that's actually a red herring that is kind of circulated outside of the area. that's an interesting thing to talk about. Yeah.
Okay. Anna or Chelsea, would you like to add something?
I mean, I guess to connect to climate change, I would say being from the Pacific Northwest and watching my family deal with the devastating forest fires,
Good point.
it's very interesting to be living here and be like, well, this is where you could come and you will not have to worry about forest fires. And so I see that in my neighborhood where I live in Johnson City, just the number of people that are moving here for various reasons. I think this area is going to change a lot in the coming years, and some of that has to do with jobs and all of that, but some of it really just has to do with people are discovering this region. The spotlight is turning here for good reasons and bad. So
Right. Okay. Thank you. Our next question is by Elijah. Oh, it disappeared. The connection,
I think
maybe.
Elijah's muted.
Oh yeah. Hi, Elijah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, great.
Please.
Thank you all for zooming in. Really appreciate all the thoughts you've had to share during the conversation. My question is for Anna specifically. I've been reading all the quotes that have been posted in the meeting chat, and one stuck out to me. It was the quote where you say, Appalachian is one of the last, quote, safe groups to stereotype in mainstream media, and that is a dehumanizing process. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that and explain why you think the media thinks it's okay to still stereotype Appalachia.
Thanks, Elijah. I needed that question because I wanted to give a shout out to a great kind of resource for people to watch that is also a documentary produced by Appalachian folks. It's just called Hillbilly, and it's a documentary that was made in 2018 by Ashley York and Sally Rubin. And it's actually a kind of history of the stereotyping of Appalachia. And some examples would be just everything from like, there's a Cletus character on The Simpsons, like Cletus, the slack-jawed yokel, you know, is an example of just that easy kind of hick stereotype that we see in the media. But also, you know, they'll talk about there's reality TV shows like even Honey Boo Boo and those kind of shows that love to kind of the American middle class loves especially to look at white poverty and laugh at it, and it reassures middle class people of their middle class status. It kind of reinscribes that every time that happens. So sometimes it's a character on a show, sometimes it's a whole show, and there's a deep trajectory of that. And so a lot of Appalachian writers, artists, media, you know, filmmakers have spent their lives trying to kind of produce alternative traditions. But there's also a distancing that happens in those representations that's so dangerous. And yeah, well, you know, one of the panels I was on this weekend at the Appalachian Studies Conference, it was called Teaching Appalachia Outside Appalachia. And we were talking about, because the other people on the panel with me were living in Chicago or in Maine or wherever, and they were trying to teach Appalachia to students that really didn't have any experience or think they didn't have any experience of it. And my friend who's in Chicago said he always asked the first day, like, how many of you have any connection to Appalachia? And, you know, nobody raises their hand. And then he turns on the light and he says, guess where that power comes from? That, you know, that electricity that I use to just turn the light on. So it's masking, you know, those representations are both othering and dehumanizing, but also masking the interrelated character of, you know, if an area is serving as a kind of colony for the extraction of resources, then everybody's, you know, part of that story. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I would recommend that Hillbilly documentary.
Oh, thank you. So Avery,
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you for all the wonderful things you've had to say. And you kind of got me thinking about this documentary Fluff had last year called Devil Put Coal in the Ground, and also the recent train derailment and the climate catastrophe in East Palestine, Ohio, which after a quick Google search, I'm pretty sure it's part of Appalachia. But I was kind of wondering if you guys could talk to the public health crisis that is so closely tied to all the climate catastrophes.
Public health. Maybe Anna would start. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I've been thinking about, and I've tried to write a couple times now, Patty, for for the Edge about what's going on in East Palestine, and you know, I'll just give, like, in the South, we answer things with stories. So I'll just tell you another story because I don't have a lot of, you know, data to point to. But, you know, about probably 3 out of the last 5 or 6 times I've gone to the Appalachian Studies Conference, there's been an environmental disaster in the area that I felt like I had to drive through to even get to the conference to talk about the region. You know, like one time it was at Marshall in West Virginia, and I had to fly into Charleston where there had just been a huge chemical spill into the water, and the whole river running through the center of Charleston was poison. And my friend's mom was like drinking bottled water, and they were going to move her to a hotel room. And, you know, and then here I am this time driving, you know, from the Finger Lakes across, you know, and down through South, you know, Appalachian, Ohio. And I'm thinking to myself, like, what am I driving through, you know, on my way to this conference? And then you have that kind of survivor's guilt of, are you kidding me? Like, you're nowhere near it, but a bunch of people are and were. And so, you know, and then crossing the river to even go into Athens, Ohio, I'm passing, you know, huge Dow chemical plants right on the Ohio River with the, you know, smokestacks with fire blasting out of them. You know, there are cancer valleys, there are chemical valleys, there's continual black lung, you know, the Manchin, the congressman out of West Virginia, just signed this. He's the most fossil fuel friendly, you know, congressman in West Virginia, Democratic Party history probably, but he, you know, he signed off on this Inflation Reduction Act. And like one piece of that was to just extend the funding around black lung for the people who were about to see that funding cut off, you know. So it's not just the train derailment, it's the black lung that people are still living with from coal mining they did decades ago, you know. You're right, it goes hand in hand, the climate dangers and the prolonged and sustained and continuing public health crises. I just keep coming back to that canary in the coal mine metaphor, because it's sort of like, I think part of not wanting to look at Appalachia is not wanting to look at the reality of what these kinds of things are going to do for a long time.
Great. Thank you. Chelsea or Matt, do you want to add something, or we can then transition towards our final thoughts, wrap up thoughts? Anything to be added on the public health side? Okay. Well, I mean, you know, we have a minute before we request you to wrap up, but I do want to go back to this great question by Anna. I mean, of course, and most important one, how do we keep the spotlight? And I think I just want to quickly add here that, you know, one of the big crises, I mean, other than climate change and many other affiliated crises that we face, is how local journalism is drying up. I mean, you know, since in less than 2 decades, 2,200 publications have died. I mean, I was reading a report in USA Today some time ago that every week 2 newspapers have been closing up in the past few years. Every week, 2 papers. And this obviously has huge implications for you know, democracy, for local civic engagement, but more importantly for giving voice to, I mean, one of the key themes that I have been sort of hearing and reading is how, where is the voice of the people in this region? And is it getting out? Is it getting that kind of attention or due acknowledgement and recognition and respect? And I think that is where local journalism or community media are so important. And I think that is perhaps one way to look at this spotlight issue. And I think the other problem, and I mean, there are many studies that have actually time and again reconfirmed the bias of the national elite media, because they're so concentrated on the two coasts, and their reporting or their framing of regions and peoples of in Appalachia. I mean, that is something also where the elite media needs to sort of rethink their own reporting. But before I should stop here, and just in a minute, I will request all three of you to please wrap up and give your final thoughts, maybe starting with you, Anna, once again.
Thank you, Raza. I'm thinking about your question or your comment about who's giving voice to the region. And, I guess I spent a little bit of time in Ireland. We have a study abroad program with my university. And one of the things I loved about Ireland was that they seem to really treasure their writers and artists. The government funds writers, and there's not like a lot of starving poets in Ireland. The poets are doing okay. And I found when I went to this Appalachian Studies conference that I think the Appalachian region feels the same way about writers. And so I would want to close by recommending that people look at some Appalachian authors that are speaking to all of these complex problems, speaking to the grief side of it, looking at the history of it and rendering some of the complicated politics of it, but in a way that demands that we connect, and as literature always does. So 3 authors that I saw this time that I want to mention as just great ones to look at. Robert Gipe, Gipe, is a Kentucky writer who has a trilogy of novels that feature, environmental activist grannies, and have a lot of comedy and also the right amount of tragedy. Carter Sickles is a trans Appalachian writer who has a couple of novels out, one of which has already been made into a film, and Robert Gipe helped produce it. And I want to mention Crystal Good, who you can go to blackbygod.org and read more about her organization, which is focused on Black folks in Appalachia, because one of the problems we all need to kind of probably correct about our understanding of the region is it is not kind of monoculture. It's a complicated place, and Crystal Good is an African-American writer and activist, and her work has been really fantastic to follow.
Thank you. Matt, your 1 minute.
Okay. 2 minutes. So 2 questions and then a suggestion. One is, how can you look into stories from another place? And the from is the key thing. And this, how do you become a media consumer, right? They're actually the same thing. But my suggestion, Anna, it's like, listen to Old Gods of Appalachia. When you regional media, biomedia, I think people have a weird idea of what it is. I mean, Old Gods of Appalachia is awesome. Like, you should listen. It's a little, be careful, but the politics of it. Who are the furry creatures or the villains of it, and just give it a listen.
Right. Yes. Okay, and we can just move to Chelsea.
Sure. So I'm going to echo both Matt and Anna in kind of closing with a recommendation about, reading these stories and thinking about these stories. And I am almost done with Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. And I feel like it's getting enough attention that people have heard of it. So I want to actually finish by reading a little bit of it, very short. But one of the analogies that the main character gives is he's talking about people making fun of Appalachia And he gives the example of like, when you're in the bathroom after gym class and you're making fun of the guy who just fell on his face, and then he walks out of the stall. And she writes, "This is what I would say if I could to all the smart people of the world with their dumb hillbilly jokes. We are right here in the stall. We can actually hear you." And I just read that last night and thought, that's it.
Wow. Exactly. Well, thank you so much for all of you, and thanks to Fleff again for putting this great roundtable. Over to you, Leah.
Thanks, Raza. Thanks to everyone. This has been such a fantastic event. There are many more fantastic events coming up in the Fleff Film Festival. So please visit the Fleff website to learn more about that. I would like to invite everyone now to unmute themselves rather, and to give our speakers a round of applause to thank them.